They found that truly active managers, those with 60% or greater differentiation from their index, had outperformed historically, and that greater differentiation tended to lead to greater outperformance. In his 2013 update, Pedihisto found that high active share portfolios outperformed dramatically from 1990 to 2009, and that these active funds had tended to hold up well during periods of crisis. As he notes, I found that the most active stock pickers have been able to add value to their investors, beating their benchmark indices by about 1.26% per year after all fees and expenses. Cohen, Polk and Silly, 2010, found that a fund's best idea, as determined by position size, generated average annualized outperformance of 6% per year. Even more importantly, they found that performance decreased in a stepwise fashion as position size decreased. Much of the conversation around active managers' historical underperformance has drawn the erroneous conclusion that these managers do not have stock-picking skill. To the contrary, it would seem that much of what besets active managers is not the ability to successfully pick stocks, but the courage to pick them in concentrated enough doses that they lead to successful outperformance. Those who employ a professional must take a lesson from Hyundai and remove the fear and anxiety associated with tracking error and career risk. Behavioral investors should be rewarded for their innovation, diligence, honesty, and most of all adherence to a thoughtful process, rather than fearing for their jobs. Only as career incentives align with best practices and a deep understanding of human behavior will we get the kind of active asset managers that we truly deserve. Procrastinate a little bit. One of the most surprising cures for excessive conservatism is something you may already be doing at work: procrastinating. Research conducted at the Tilburg Institute for Behavioral Economics Research found that subjects chose the default option 82% of the time when asked to decide in an instant, but only 56% of time after being given a short delay. Speed tends to be the enemy of good decision-making, and immediacy nudges us to rely on biased thinking and over-rely on the status quo. 90 So, when tasked with making an important investing decision, take time to reconsider your immediate choice and see if you still think the same after more thought. Mitigate disaster. Peters and Slavic parse the psychological elements of risk into two camps: dread and risk of the unknown. Dread is their shorthand for catastrophic loss of capital, and the unknown is the risk of unforeseen calamities. Academics differentiate between risk and uncertainty with the distinction that the former has known probabilities and the latter entails ambiguous gambles. Playing blackjack with a single deck of cards is risky, whereas investing in capital markets is somewhere more middling along the risk-uncertainty continuum. And while this may seem like semantic trifling at first, neuroimaging studies demonstrate that risk and uncertainty actually activate different areas of the brain. Using fMRI, researchers have found that ambiguity, but not risk, causes an activation of the frontal insula and amygdala. Similarly, they found that brain-damaged participants showed no difference in brain activation between risky and uncertain conditions, ironically leading them to act more rationally than their neurotypical peers. Risky situations, where probabilities are understood, lend themselves to logical and statistical thinking. Uncertain situations like capital markets, where unknown unknowns run rampant, require looser controls in the form of rules of thumb. Investing capital comes with a host of unknowns, but uncertain outcomes make the need for certain processes that much more important. As behavioral investors tilt probability in their favor over extended periods of time, they reduce uncertainty and improve the probability of getting the right result for the right reasons. As much as we dislike uncertainty, our world would be mind-numbingly dull without it. Stocks would cease to be profitable, sporting events would be dull, comedy would lose its bite. Consider the person who remains unattached to avoid risking heartache and finds loneliness in the process. Or the would-be entrepreneur who never makes the leap of faith and wastes a career working at a job he hates. The irony of obsessive loss aversion is that our worst fears become realized in our attempts to manage them. Behavioral investors take a clear-eyed view of risk and uncertainty in a world that distorts them out of fear, and their lives are richer for it. No regrets. So much of conservatism boils down to regret aversion, We would rather lose with inaction than have the possibility of winning by taking action. Once again, a rules-based system is the best way to avoid the paralysis brought about by regret aversion. Buy, sell and hold decisions are made in an emotionally cool state in a manner that is informed by research. This rules-based approach takes discretion out of the picture entirely and allows the fund manager a psychic scapegoat. If things go wrong, blaming the model feels better than kicking yourself. Prepare for the worst. Why is it that the residents of Pompeii watched Vesuvius erupt for hours without evacuating? Why did tens of thousands fail to evacuate New Orleans as Hurricane Katrina approached? Why did passengers on the Titanic ignore orders to disembark even as the luxury liner approached the iceberg that would end their lives? Each of the aforementioned moments of paralysis in the face of disaster are part of a failure of imagination known as the normalcy bias. Simply put, the normalcy bias is the belief that all that has been is all that will ever be. Pompeii had seen earthquakes before and New Orleans had seen torrential rains, the citizens of each city imagining that this time would be like the last, until it wasn't. Estimated to impact as much as 70% of us, normalcy bias leads us to believe that we have experienced all we can ever experience. 91A 2001 study by sociologist Thomas Drabek found that when people were ordered to leave to escape a natural disaster, the average evacuee checked with 4 different sources before deciding how to act. 92 Journalist Amanda Ripley, author of The Unthinkable, Who Survives When Disaster Strikes, suggests that a decision to act in the face of a crisis consists of 3 parts: denial, deliberation and decisive movement. Although created for coping with natural disasters, Ripley's framework can be valuable to investors who find themselves in the throes of a potential financial crisis as well. The behavioral investor takes denial off of the table from the outset, understanding that financial tumult is a natural part of every investor's lifetime and that corrections happen every year on average and that full-blown bear markets occur every 3.5 years on average. Understanding and accepting a high level of volatility from the outset is a prerequisite to sound investing. If you've seen it before, you will see it again, and you've not experienced it, just wait a little longer. Deliberation and decisive movement can be problematic because we tend to be psychologically at our worst at the very moment when we most need to be in charge of all of our faculties. As I cited in The Laws of Wealth, the average investor loses 13% of their IQ in a time of financial duress. The best antidote against bad behavior in a moment of potential threat is an investing system for managing risk that is adhered to in all weather. The specific type of system, whether a simple process of broad diversification or a more complex tactical system, is far less important than the discipline to define rules in peacetime and adhere to them in wartime. A behaviorally informed investment paradigm should be robust to periods of mania and panic even greater than those observed historically. It is worth repeating that every developed country in the world has suffered equity market losses of at least 75%, so at least that level of disaster is possible in your lifetime. But the behavioral investor prepares for what could be and not just what has been. After all, there is no assurance that the Great Depression will be the greatest depression when considered on a long enough timeline. The behavioral investor's most difficult job is to set in place a system that recognizes the reality that most market volatility is a short-term blip while still humbly respecting the rare capability of financial markets to destroy capital at a clip that is nearly unrecoverable. Flip the script. Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's right-hand man, is most commonly known for admonition to invert, always invert. Although Munger popularized the phrase, the original idea belongs to esteemed mathematician Carl Jacobi, who was espousing the benefits of considering, why might I be wrong? Or, what is another way of viewing this situation? Nick Bostrom, known primarily for his doomsday musings on artificial intelligence, has proposed a more elaborate theorem in this same vein that he refers to as the reversal test. Bostrom says, when a proposal to change a certain parameter is thought to have bad overall consequences, consider a change to the same parameter in the opposite direction. If this is also thought to have bad overall consequences, then the onus is on those who reach these conclusions to explain why our position cannot be improved through changes to this parameter. If they are unable to do so, then we have reason to suspect that they suffer from status quo bias. 93. To make these ideas a little more intuitive, consider your morning cup of coffee. Let's say you have taken the advice of many a personal finance guru to question every expense and have been confronted with your daily Starbucks addiction. But applying the reversal test, rather than asking yourself whether to spend $5 on coffee, you instead ask, would I take a payment of $5 not to drink coffee that day? If the answer is yes, you should abstain. Munger and Jacoby's ideas around inversion and Bostrom's suggestion to reverse both offer simple but powerful ways to reframe our thinking in a manner that moves us away from tradition and toward more lucid ways of thinking. ****. Conservatism risk is a byproduct of our asymmetrical preference for gain relative to loss, and for the status quo relative to change. We like winning much more than losing and the old way much better than the new way, all of which contorts our ability to see the world clearly. This conservatism effect can be observed in our resistance to new ways of being, status quo bias, our preference for no risk at all relative to large incremental decreases in risk, zero risk bias, and an aptness to privilege our current self over the needs of our future self, hyperbolic discounting. A preference for the familiar may be understandable, but it can also rob us of the opportunity to meet new people, explore new ways of being, and properly allocate our wealth. Embracing the unfamiliar is a commitment that enriches a life as surely as it improves investing. Crafting conservatism-resistant portfolios. Fact: the perceived riskiness of an asset class often has more to do with its short-term than long-term performance. So what? Behavioral investors load up on assets, like stocks, that are perceived as more risky than is accurate. Fact: risk-taking is more situationally than personally determined. So what? Avoid fear-inducing situations and ensure that portfolio management processes are rules-based rather than discretionary. Fact: bubbles are a natural, recurring feature of capital markets. So what? Have a rules-based system for avoiding catastrophic loss that is infrequently, i.e., every few years, activated. Notes: 76. W. Samuelson and Richard Zeckhauser, Status Quo Bias in Decision-Making, Journal of Risk and Uncertainty 1-1. March 1988, pp. 7-59. 77. R. Henderson, How Powerful is Status Quo Bias? Psychology Today, September 29, 2016. 78. Simon Ruse's review of R. Thaler and C. Sunstein's Nudge, Penguin, 2009. In Amsterdam Law Forum 1-4, 2009. 79. S. M. Fleming, C. L. Thomas and R. J. Dolan, Overcoming Status Quo Bias in the Human Brain, Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States of America 107, 13, February 2010, pp. 6005-6009. 80. A. Nicole, S. M. Fleming, D. R. Bach, J. Driver and R. J. Dolan, A Regret-Induced Status Quo Bias, Journal of Neuroscience 31-9, March 2011, pp. 3320-3327. 81. Overcoming Home Bias in Equity Investing, Janus Henderson Investors, September 2017. 82. M. Hulbert, A Plan to Overcome Investors' Home Bias, New York Times, January 23, 2000. 83. D. Sassoon, Becoming Mona Lisa, Harvest Books, 2003. 84. S. Butler, To Get Rich, Stifle Emotion-Driven Investment Picks, USA Today, January 25, 2015. 85. N. Nicholson, E. Sohn, M. F. O'Creevy and P. Willman, Personality and Domain-Specific Risk-Taking, Journal of Risk Research Aid to 2, 2005. 86. A. W. Lowe, D. V. Repin and B. N. Steenbarger, Fear and Greed in Financial Markets, A Clinical Study of Day Traders, MIT Sloan Working Paper No. 4534-05, March 2005. 87. Lowe, Repin and Steenbarger, Fear and Greed in Financial Markets. 88. R. Schmidt, Frozen, Using Behavioral Design to Overcome Decision-Making Paralysis, Deloitte Insights, October 7, 2016. 89. T. Howard, Behavioral Portfolio Management, Harriman House, 2014, page 95. 90B Frick, How to Beat Our Status Quo Bias, Keipelinger, December 2, 2010. 91E Inglis Arkell, The Frozen Calm of Normalcy Bias, Gizmodo, May 2, 2013. 92A Ripley, How to Get Out Alive, Time Magazine, April 25, 2005. 93N Bostrom and Tjord, The Reversal Test. Eliminating Status Quo Bias in Applied Ethics, Ethics 116. July 2006, pp. 656-679. Calm Chapter 10. The Behavioral Investor Hones Attention. It is a very sad thing that nowadays there is so little useless information. Oscar Wilde. The Salem witch trials, conducted in colonial Massachusetts between 1692 and 1693, resulted in the deaths of over 20 women. The fear of witches in the New World was a holdover from Europe, where tens of thousands of women feared to be in league with the devil were executed between the 1300s to the end of the 1600s. In the late 1600s, a war between France and England, King William's War, was playing out on colonial American soil and led to the displacement of hundreds of refugees, many of whom fled to Salem. This influx of refugees placed a strain on an already struggling community and led to conditions perfect for hysteria. In January of 1692, the daughter of a local clergyman and two of her friends started to exhibit strange symptoms: unintelligible utterances, physical contortions, and fits of rage. As a father of 3 small children, this sounds like any given Tuesday at the Crosby household, but I digress. Spurred on by a local doctor who attributed their symptoms to the supernatural, the girls accused 3 women of having hexed them: an elderly woman, a homeless woman, and a Caribbean slave. The former 2 denied the accusations vehemently, but the slave, named Tituba, fessed up to being in league with the powers of darkness. With this admission, the fuse was lit and the dormant witch hysteria began to run amok in the colonies. Ostensibly being good Christian people of law and order, the colonists could not simply burn a witch without proof. Witch hunting. Experts set forth a number of theories for how to divine whether or not someone was indeed a witch, including eyewitness accounts and spectral evidence, such as having dreamt of being cursed by the accused. But the most famous test involved water. The accused was thrown in the water, where buoyancy was seen as evidence of guilt and drowning was evidence of a false accusation. Small consolation to the now deceased innocent party. The accusers had set up a kangaroo court that operated by a set of rules incapable of gathering relevant data. The obvious catch-22 of the water trial was that you were guilty or dead, hardly the dispassionate weighing of evidence that we would hope for when making a high-stakes decision. Attention risk is born of our disposition to evaluate information in relative terms and let salience trump probability when making investment decisions. Salience is the psychological term for prominence, meaning that our attention can be hijacked by low probability high scariness things like shark attacks while ignoring high probability low scariness dangers like taking a selfie near a busy street. Yes, far more people have died in the last year from selfies than shark attacks. It's what led the New Englanders to ignore the unwinnable nature of the witch trials and ignited a moral panic spurred on by stories that were vivid, if nonsensical. It also leads us to rate the unfamiliar as more risky and show a preference for domestic stocks, home bias, and familiar names, mere exposure effect, regardless of their fundamental qualities. In a world in which attention is a valuable resource, we must be vigilant against noise peddlers of all sorts. To do so requires a system for distinguishing meaningful information from cacophony, which is where we journey next. The following 3-part test will help you to recognize probably when you see it. 3 tests of an investable idea. The first hurdle an idea must clear to be considered worthy of a behavioral investor is that it has a rich history of empirical support. The data must support your assertion, period. But if theory without data gives us witch trials, it must also be noted that data without theory can be just as dangerous. I noted earlier the 95% covariance between Bangladeshi butter production and S&P 500 moves. The data exists but the theory does not. Why on earth should those two things be correlated? A similarly spurious correlation is the Super Bowl indicator, which states that if a team from the American Football Conference, AFC, wins the Super Bowl, we will experience a bear market, and that a win from the National Football Conference, NFC, augurs a bull market. The indicator was first discovered by Leonard Koppett in the 1970s when he realized that it had never been wrong until that point. As of 2017, the Super Bowl indicator still enjoys an 80% success rate. Just as theory with no data leads to witch trials, data with no theory can lead us to chase shadows of truth. If there is no good reason for a data point to correlate with outsized returns, it probably doesn't. Thus, sound theory is the second hurdle. In most truth-seeking pursuits, it is enough to look for empirical evidence that is supported by a cogent theoretical framework. But financial markets offer a bit of a special case inasmuch as theoretically sound, empirically supported anomalies are prone to get arbitraged away as quickly as they are discovered. Smart people discover truths about the market, share them with the world, and return hungry arbitrageurs ensure that those truths don't stay true for long. Take, for instance, calendar effects, the market anomaly that suggests that certain days of the week or month offer the potential for outsized returns because of fund flows and other variables. Calendar effects were discovered by examining the data and thus pass our empirical hurdle. There is also a rational reason why they existed. Events like paying taxes, receiving paychecks and rebalancing portfolios happen with some regularity with respect to timing, and that regularity presented real opportunity, so the theory test is met. But what calendar effects, and many other market anomalies, lack is the third and final trait that behavioral investors require. It must owe to an enduring psychological tendency. There is no psychic pain in arbitraging calendar effects. It is not behaviorally more difficult to buy on one day of the month versus another, and so the effect vanished nearly as quickly as it was discovered. For a factor to be worthwhile to a behavioral investor, it must be empirically supported, theoretically sound, and behaviorally intransigent. When it comes to determining whether or not a variable meets this third and most difficult to determine hurdle, one great guide is time. Named for a deli in New York, the Lindy effect is the idea that the life expectancy of an idea is proportional to its current age. In a nutshell, ideas that have stood the test of time are likely to continue to stand the test of time. People have read the work of Homer for thousands of years, and we can anticipate that middle school children will still be reading the Odyssey 500 years from now. Kim Kardashian's book of selfies, Selfish, recently landed on the New York Times bestseller list and is currently outselling the Odyssey. However, the Lindy effect tells us that despite the intensity of its immediate reception, Selfish is not as likely to endure as the Odyssey precisely because it has not yet stood the test of time. Calendar effects were discovered, got a handful of professors' tenure, and were quickly arbitraged away. Conversely, factors like value and momentum have endured over time and can be said to be robust to the Lindy effect. They have endured and are therefore likely to continue enduring. While quality, originality, and import may be some of the markers of Lindy endurance in literature, psychology seems to play that role when it comes to capital markets. Value investing is psychologically difficult, something that will be discussed in great detail later in this book, and therefore endures in spite of the fact that we know it to be profitable. You can read every academic journal article and biography of Warren Buffett ever written and still find it stomach-churningly difficult to buy the sort of unloved stocks that are the hallmark of the style. Value investing is empirically supported, theoretically sound, and behaviorally rooted, and therefore meets all three criteria for investment. My father, a deeply principled man and Rotarian, keeps a plaque with Rotary's four-way test on his desk. The four parts of the test are: is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? Will it be beneficial to all concerned? These four simple steps offer a guiding framework that my father uses to evaluate the quality of various actions he is considering. In much the same manner, the behavioral investor can use the three conditions of an investable idea to evaluate the soundness of both existing research and the new anomalies that will inevitably arise. Truth in capital markets emerges in ways that are evident to the senses and pleasing to the mind, but it endures by virtue of its roots in human psychology. The three-part test of an investable idea isn't your only defense against financial noise. Read on for more practical ways to discern the things that matter from those that don't. Results as a poor predictor. Counterintuitively, results are a surprisingly poor predictor of how sound a strategy is. A market-beating 3-year track record, the minimum hurdle for most institutional investors, still has a 12.5% chance of being total luck. It takes nearly 25 years of track record to separate luck from skill, meaning that you can only know via results that a manager was good as she is nearing retirement. The deceptive nature of results makes our focus on theory, data, and psychology all the more relevant. Tools for combating attention bias. Play the odds, ditch the story. Jeff Foxworthy, that lovable avatar of all things backwoods, used to host a TV show called, "Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader?" It asked grade school questions of adults who had long since forgotten their lessons. Today, I will be your host on a game show that I call, "Are You Smarter Than a Rat?" Rather than quizzing you on the War of 1812 or long division, you'll be presented with two lights, green and red, that will flash randomly. Your task will be to determine whether the next flash will be green or red. To make your job that much simpler, I'll even tell you the odds. The green light will flash 80% of the time and the red light will flash 20% of the time. The rat you are competing against can't speak, of course, so the green light will provide food while the red light will provide a small electric shock. Consider your strategy for a moment. How would you best determine the color of the next flash with a known 80/20ths distribution pattern? Most humans begin the task and immediately begin to look for noise in the chaos. They try to discern a pattern. Which makes sense if you think back to the opening chapter of this book and recall that organizing functional fictions into powerful social structures is what separates us from animals. By seeking to create signal in what is truly noise, human participants in this test are able to identify the red or green signal 68% of the time. The rats, on the other hand, have no need, or ability, for higher-order thinking and quickly learn to just play the odds. Quickly ascertaining that food comes about 4 times more often than shocks, they learn to guess green every time and end up with an 80% hit rate. The rats have no need to beat the system or craft an elegant story, and the simplicity of their approach allows them to outwit an ostensibly smarter opponent. The market analog of this is evident every time you turn on a financial news channel. Some Ivy League-educated market wizard in a $3,000 suit is expounding a complicated macro thesis that interweaves everything from geopolitical threats to potential Fed moves to soybean production. Listening to such a story is hypnotic and rightly impressive. The human ability for higher-order thinking and pattern recognition is on full display. But all too often our market wizard is like the human subject in our game show who has overcomplicated the task. The elegance of the story has overtaken the likelihood of its occurrence. The behavioral investor thinks like a rat, caring only for probability in a world that craves sophisticated nonsense. When asked to weave a story on a prominent financial news network, a behavioral investor will have no grand thesis, no series of dominoes waiting to fall. Accordingly, she will never be invited back. Instead, she will pursue a process-driven path of tilting probability in her favor at every turn, secure in the knowledge that probably is a powerful word in investing. Rely on averages. To examine the presence of the attention bias in your own thinking, please consider the following question. A police force uses breathalyzers that display false drunkenness in 5% of cases but are 100% accurate in detecting cases of true inebriation. On average, 1 in 1,000 drivers is drunk. Suppose that a police officer stops a random car at a checkpoint and forces the driver to take a breathalyzer test that comes back positive. What are the true odds of this individual being drunk? The most common response, drawing on the 5% false positive mentioned above, is that there is a 95% chance that the person stopped is drunk. Is that what you guessed? In reality, the odds are much lower and show how we tend to ignore base rates, low attentional salience, in favor of a specific observation, high attentional salience. Thinking fast leads us to believe with 95% certainty that the person stopped is a drunk driver, but a slower, more contemplative consideration of the facts tells a much different story. Consider that, on average, if our checkpoint stops 1,000 drivers, that one of them will be drunk and will be correctly identified as such. This means that 999 drivers will not be drunk, but that a full 49.95 of them, 5% of 999, will be identified as having broken the law. The true odds of being both drunk and identified as such in a random stop would be the base rate of 1 divided by the number of positive breathalyzer tests, 49.95 false positives plus the 1 true positive, or 50.95, with 1/50.95 equals 0.019627. Far from our attentionally salient guess of 95%, the true odds of being correctly identified by a random breathalyzer stop are really just south of 2%. Don't feel bad if you missed this, though. When similar problems were given to Harvard medical students, nearly half guessed 95%.94. Hell, I just wrote this and worked out the math myself, and there is still a nagging part of me that wants to believe the power of the observation over the logic of the story. Such is our all too human tendency to ignore averages. The lesson here is that a consideration of averages can lead us to appropriately prepare for an uncertain future and manage risk. If 50% of people get divorced, you, on your wedding day, the happiest day of your life, have a 50% chance of divorce too. A longboard asset management study found that nearly 40% of stocks lose money over their lifetime, that 64% underperform a broad market index, and that 1/4 of stocks account for basically all of the gains in the market over time. For active stock pickers, that means that the shares you have just spent months researching and believe in so fully have a 1 in 4 chance of being a real winner. This dose of cold reality can seem depressing until you realize its potential for avoiding disaster. Imagine a world in which couples, before walking down the aisle, received appropriate premarital counseling and thought deeply about their decision to come together. Or an asset management industry market, not by bravado, but by a reverence for the task of managing other people's money and the attendant difficulties therein. It can be painful consider in the here and now that we are average, but it can prevent a lifetime of painful tomorrows. Look for simple solutions. I grew up in Huntsville, Alabama, a town affectionately known as the Rocket City because of a proud heritage of contributions to the space industry. Home to Space Camp and the U.S. Space and Rocket Center, the Huntsville skyline is dominated by a Saturn V rocket. While the Saturn V is undoubtedly the star of the show, my attention was drawn to a space shuttle on the museum grounds on a recent visit to my hometown. While passing by the shuttle, I was keyed in on a detail that seemed out of place. The external fuel tank looked rough and rusty compared to the gleaming, white exterior of the rest of the shuttle. A little research unearths that the fuel tank's orange appearance is not the result of design negligence, but rather an example of the power of simple solutions to have enormous reach. The Space Shuttle's first 2 voyages, STS-1 and STS-2, featured an external fuel tank that was painted the same brilliant white as the solid rocket boosters and the orbiter itself. But after these early explorations, it became apparent that the shuttle would benefit from a bit of a diet. It needed to shed roughly 600 pounds to function at optimal capacity. 95 Undaunted by the task, rocket scientists set out to do what rocket scientists do. They experimented with space-age materials and looked for aerodynamic efficiencies, all to no avail. At a point of particular frustration, a low-paid line worker became aware of these efforts and suggested quite simply, "Why don't you just stop painting the tank?" The paint required to paint the tank weighed right at 600 pounds, and the rest is ugly orange history. Odds are, you are reading this book looking for some sort of edge in financial markets. Insights that will help you wring a few extra basis points out of a market that can feel remarkably efficient at times. This is a worthwhile cause, but in these efforts you must be sure not to overlook the simple and effective solutions that might be staring you in the face. Morningstar, keepers of the keys to a financial data goldmine, found that fees are the best predictor of fund performance. Not a rockstar manager, not an empirically valid process, not an informational edge, but fees. 96. Further, A team at Fidelity set out to examine the behaviors of their best-performing retail accounts in an effort to isolate the behaviors of truly exceptional investors. When they contacted the owners of the best-performing accounts, the common thread tended to be that they had forgotten about the account altogether or had died. So much for isolating the complex behavioral traits of skilled investors. Attentional bias leads us to have what behavioral finance expert Brian Portnoy refers to as a fetish for complexity. That can lead us to ignore important tools at our disposal on a snipe hunt for something grander. Avoid being too smart by half. Alexander Pope is generally credited with coining the idea that a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, a sentiment excerpted from his 1709, an essay on criticism, where he opined, "A little learning is a dangerous thing. Drink deep, or taste not the Pierian spring. Their shallow draughts intoxicate the brain, and drinking largely sobers us again." However, Pope's warning about cursory knowledge is actually predated by a similar expression penned by an anonymous author, going only by the initials AB, who wrote in The Mystery of Fanaticism, "A little knowledge is apt to puff up and make men giddy, but a greater share of it will set them right, and bring them to low and humble thoughts of themselves." Original credit aside, this idea absolutely holds sway in the study of behavioral finance and is a useful caveat for those seeking to root out error in their decision-making process. Becoming knowledgeable about oneself and the machinations of human thought can be a giddy, dizzying affair that excites us to the point that we are eager to apply our knowledge. But if this knowledge is applied too superficially, it can exacerbate our existing decisional errors as a result of having learned more. Our knowledge of psychological bias can become just another cog in the machine of our bad reasoning. Consider Tabor and Lodge's work in Motivated Skepticism in the Evaluation of Political Beliefs. 97. They found a handful of different ways in which our pre-existing beliefs about the world impact our thinking, some of which are actually worsened by further education. Two examples include attitude polarization. Exposing subjects to a balanced set of pro and con considerations actually strengthened their initial position. Sophistication effect. Knowledgeable subjects actually showed a greater tendency to engage in confirmation bias, disconfirmation bias, and prior attitude effect, evaluating supportive arguments more favorably than counter-arguments. Knowledge of behavioral tendencies can be used as a bright light of introspection about our motives, but it can also be used as a cudgel to hit dissenters with as we carry on defending the status quo. To avoid this misuse of knowledge, the behavioral investor should be sure to apply extra scrutiny to matters that are personally meaningful to us or that we wish deeply to be true or false. We must also consistently seek feedback from those with diverse viewpoints, track our own decisional efficacy, and examine the deepest motivations behind our thoughts and actions. It is only in so doing that we are able to combat the real human tendency to hold information that we cherish to a laxer standard than that we disdain. Size matters. Warren Buffett states that the combination of likelihood and impact are at the heart of everything Berkshire Hathaway does. Take the probability of loss times the amount of possible loss from the probability of gain times the amount of possible gain. That is what we're trying to do. It's imperfect, but that's what it's all about. Put more concretely, a low likelihood event with great upside or downside may be well worth attending to. Conversely, a likely event with limited scope may just as well be worth ignoring. Given both the psychological, we hate losses 2.5 times as much as gains, and mathematical, it takes a 100% gain to erase a 50% loss, realities of negative events, they warrant special consideration by behavioral investors. Nassim Taleb gives a wonderful example of this in his book, Fooled by Randomness. He relates the story of meeting with fellow traders and sharing with them his belief that the market would likely rise in the following week. Realizing that he had a short position on, the traders were confused. Why be short a market you think is likely to rise? To explain, Taleb showed them the following chart. Event Pro. Probability outcome expected value. MAR 70% plus 1% plus 0.7. Market goes down 30% minus 10% minus 3.0. Total 100% minus 2.3. Taleb believed there to be an asymmetry between the size of losses and gains that might occur. Although there was a greater likelihood that the market would rise, as is almost always the case, the repercussions of a falling market, however unlikely, were much more dramatic. Thus, he operated from his best estimate of expected value and not just simple probability. Probability confirms that optimism ought to be the de facto position of the well-informed investor. Markets usually go up. But there are two things that begin to give investors pause and would warrant taking a more defensive position. The first is flagging momentum, which increases the probability that the market will fall in value. The second is steep valuations, which increase the intensity of the potential crash. The further disconnected the market becomes from its long-term averages, the more violently it crashes back to earth at such time as it does revert. Thus, the behavioral investor has the default position of being aggressively invested until such time as momentum begins to slacken, probability, and valuations are extreme, intensity. Such an approach honors both the value of probability and the potential intensity of a low probability occurrence. The behavioral investor learns to ask both, how likely is it, and how big is it? Give it time. One of the most frustrating aspects of probabilistic investing is that sometimes doing the right thing does not guarantee a good result. You are sometimes left with the worst of both worlds, the lack of a comforting narrative and a poor result. It frankly stinks, and the knowledge that you played by the rules is small comfort. It is precisely for this reason that probabilistically informed investing gets abandoned with regularity. It is only with time and multiple iterations that probability evinces its true value. As Cullen Roche points out on his blog, Pragmatic Capitalism, the market is essentially random when viewed on a daily basis. 98 An investor following a rules-based behavioral approach is not much more likely than a monkey throwing darts to get a good result. Daily fluctuations average a gain of 0.03%. Considered on a monthly basis, returns begin to take some shape, but there is still a great deal of noise. Accordingly, there is very little guarantee of getting the right result for taking the right action. But as we back out even further, real patterns begin to emerge. The annualized return of the market is nearly 13% from 1950 to present, and a clear, positive trend now emerges. The longer your horizon, the more likely you are to get the right result for the right reason. Behavioral investing must be long-term to be effective. Creating a behaviorally informed portfolio is like running an insurance company in microcosm. First, you protect yourself against negative externalities by screening out the infirm. The ethics of this are questionable, but insurance companies charge smokers, the obese, and those with pre-existing conditions a premium precisely because they are likely to be expensive to insure. Likewise, a behavioral investor begins by doing no harm and screening out any stocks that appear to be fraudulent, at risk for bankruptcy, or otherwise sick. Second, the insurance company and shrewd investor both diversify. Just as the healthiest triathlete can die in a freak accident, even inexpensive, high-quality stocks with a catalyst have an uncertain fate. By bundling risk, i.e., diversifying, the likelihood increases that doing the right thing for the right reasons will pay off. Finally, be patient. The long-term prognosis for any individual human is, well, not great. No amount of good diet and exercise keeps us from the inevitability of illness and death, and yet, insurance companies do just fine, too fine, frankly, but that's another book, because most people are healthy most of the time. Similarly, the long-term prognosis for most stocks is shockingly bad. Longboard Asset Management's The Capitalism Distribution paints the picture. 39% of stocks were unprofitable. 18.5% of stocks suffered catastrophic losses of at least 75%. 64% of stocks underperformed the Russell 3000. 25% of stocks account for almost all performance. Just as insurance companies profitably cover humans prone to disease and death, behavioral investors can reap tremendous financial rewards from a system in which a great many stocks underperform or flat-out collapse. Doing so requires persistence in the face of short-term failure and adherence to a set of time-tested principles. But most of all, it takes patience. Like many of the tendencies we have discussed herein, attention bias is the byproduct of a strained system looking for practical shortcuts. While this system of bringing the scariest and loudest information to the fore works nicely in some contexts, it can be the undoing of an investor looking to act sensibly in a world of breathless pundits and panicked counterparties. By taking a step back and applying some of the exercises mentioned above, the behavioral investor is able to keep her head when all around are losing theirs. Creating attention-proof portfolios. Fact. Probably is a powerful word in investing. So what? Complicated macro narratives should be scrupulously ignored. Fact. The likelihood of an event and the intensity of its impact are both important considerations. So what? The default state of a strategy should be bullishness, but ought to include a contingency for low-likelihood high-intensity events. Fact. Data without theory and theory without data both produce spurious results. So what? An investable factor must be empirically evident, theoretically sound and have roots in behavior. Notes. 94D Greller, Jumping to Conclusions, Base Rate Neglect, Invisible Laws, September 11, 2011. 95T Rogoway, This is Why the Space Shuttle's External Fuel Tank Stopped Being Painted White, Foxtrot Alpha, October 16, 2015. 96R Kinnell, How Fund Fees Are the Best Predictor of Returns, Morningstar, October 4, 2016. 97 CS Tabor and M. Lodge, Motivated Skepticism in the Evaluation of Political Beliefs, American Journal of Political Science 50-3, July 2006, pp. 755. The behavioral investor manages emotion. I don't want to be at the mercy of my emotions. I want to use them, to enjoy them, and to dominate them. Oscar Wilde, The Picture of Dorian Gray. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. arrived in Washington on the evening of August 26 without any prepared remarks for his address to the hundreds of thousands of supporters that would gather in front of Lincoln Memorial the next day. Whereas his fellow speakers that day had meticulously prepared and had handed out advance copies of their remarks, Dr. King had hung back, hoping to imbue his speech with an authenticity and urgency of which over-preparation can be the enemy. That night, the great man first set pen to paper, not finalizing his remarks until well after midnight. As he set down his pen and retired to bed, there was no mention of, "I have a dream," anywhere in his prepared remarks. King approached the podium, prepared to give a speech about racial harmony, albeit devoid of what we now know to be his signature oratorical turn of phrase. Just before commencing, Mahalia Jackson, a gospel singer in the audience, shouted, "Tell him about the dream," referencing his mention of a dream of racial unity mentioned 5 years earlier in Detroit. Setting aside his notes and speaking from the heart, King then launched into what may well be the most powerful speech in American history. Dr. King's extemporaneous approach gave full expression to the emotion he felt as part of the civil rights movement and has inspired generations of Americans to be wary of the bigotry of the past. By harnessing the power of emotion that day, King secured his legacy and changed the fate of a nation. Emotion served Dr. King well because he was tasked with changing the minds, but more importantly the hearts, of an American people mired in the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. But as we have learned in previous chapters, behavioral adaptations that are rational and even recommended in one context can prove ill-suited for the often unorthodox demands made upon us as investors. In The Laws of Wealth, I highlight a number of discrepancies between the realities of our lived everyday and what I call Wall Street bizarro world. To name just a few, on Wall Street the future is more certain than the present, the crowd is less intelligent than an individual, and doing less is better than more. We could easily add to that list the reality that emotion, a trait that evolved to help us make faster and better decisions in our daily lives, can lead us seriously astray when making investment decisions. Emotion risk stems from the fact that our perceptions of danger are colored by both our transitory emotional states and our individual propensity toward positivity or negativity. Emotion leads most of us to underrate the possibility of bad things happening to us, optimism bias, to avoid even thinking about what might go wrong, ostrich effect, and to ignore the important role emotion plays in our decisions, empathy gap. When fear does break through, it can become so powerful that we can be immobilized by trying to avoid pain, negativity bias. But for all the havoc emotion can wreak on a rational investment process, many investors also speak to an intuitive sixth sense that informs decision-making. Is reducing the emotional aspects of investing possible or even desirable, or are we leaving a valuable form of advantage on the table? Our understanding of emotion is expanding and, with it, so are the number of emotions themselves. René Descartes believed in just 6 core emotions and no less an authority than Pixar's Inside Out speaks to 5, but modern researchers paint a far more nuanced picture that is highly culture-dependent. As Dr. Tiffany Watt Smith says, fear might seem like an irreducible emotion of our most animal selves. But the Pintupi, whose home is in the deserts of Western Australia, speak of as many of as 15 distinct sorts of fear. For instance, the fright that makes you jump up and look around you, Ngini Waringu, the creeping dread that a rival is seeking revenge, Ngulu, and the terror felt when malevolent spirits are around, Konarumju. A second complicating factor in the delineation of emotion is that some feelings are experienced very much as a combination of other emotions. Consider nostalgia, which is equal parts sadness, longing, fondness, and joy. Dr. Watt Smith, who has herself compiled an encyclopedia of feeling, has named and described over 150 different types of emotion, a giant leap from Descartes' idea of scarcely a handful. While a definitive taxonomy of emotion may not be forthcoming, the point remains that emotion is powerful, pervasive, and impacts every choice we make and every minute of each day. Emotion can assist our decisions or destroy them, but it is only as we became aware of its power and ubiquity that we are effectively able to make it serve our ends. To begin this effort, please consider the following. Tools for overcoming emotion. Don't beat it, join it. Many martial arts rely on what is referred to as the circular theory of self-defense, meaning that the momentum and exertion of an attacker can actually be used to your advantage. Imagine being rushed by a would-be assailant who speeds toward you with arms extended. Rather than meeting the full force of his momentum head-on, you might sidestep this rush, deflecting the outstretched arm, leading him to rush past, now vulnerable to counterattack. This approach of working with a powerful force and not against a powerful force is instructive to investors seeking to manage emotion en route to making wise investment decisions. It can be tempting to want to stop emotion in its tracks, but oftentimes, the more adaptive approach is to repurpose it for more favorable outcomes. Behavioral finance is sometimes mistakenly seen as a vehicle for ridding investors of their pesky emotions and irrational quirks en route to them becoming something like the Homo economicus that economists long imagined them to be. If we could just rid ourselves of irrationality, the thought goes, we would make perfect financial decisions. The only problem is, sometimes behavior that is irrational in the strictest sense of the word can greatly aid our quest to reach our financial goals. Being a behavioral investor is less about adhering to some textbook notion of rationality and more about understanding and bending the idiosyncrasies of human nature to our advantage. Consider the work of Nobel Prize winner Richard Thaler, who first discovered and named what we now refer to as mental accounting, the tendency to separate money into different buckets and spend or save it differently depending on how it is labeled. Studies have shown that people are apt to save money labeled as a rebate but to spend money labeled as a bonus. Barack Obama and his advisors, Richard Thaler among them, used framing to position the stimulus given out after the Great Recession as a bonus to incent recipients to buy big screen TVs rather than hoard it. This simple notion is the basis for goals-based investing or personal benchmarking, the process of intentionally dividing money into safety, income, and growth buckets and investing it accordingly. It seems incredible that something as simple as labeling money can induce us to save and invest differently, but as George Lowenstein says, while it seems like an inconsequential process, earmarking can have a dramatic effect on retirement savings. Chima and Soman, 2009, found that earmarking savings in an envelope labeled with a picture of a couple's children nearly doubled the savings rate of very low-income parents. Is it rational that we save twice as much money when someone plays on our feelings of love for our children? Absolutely not. Can we understand this about ourselves and use it to our advantage? Absolutely. What Richard Thaler was cleverly able to do was demonstrate that behavioral traits largely deemed harmful can actually be used for good. Take for example the status quo bias, which is the tendency toward inaction. Thaler, understanding that people tended to make a decision once and not question it again, determined to use this to the benefit of the woefully unprepared American pre-retiree. He developed a program titled Save More Tomorrow that allowed savers to make a decision once to automate their savings behavior and auto-escalate the amount withdrawn when their pay increased. 99 Thaler understood that asking people to make the right decision month after month was much more difficult than simply setting it and forgetting it. Once again, it is patently irrational that we should be so susceptible to the status quo bias that we can lock in a behavior once and effectively forget about it for life. But by some estimates, this simple idea has contributed more than $29 billion to the accounts of American savers. 100 rational? Maybe not, but I'll take it. Just as Thaler and his colleagues discovered, some of our psychological peccadillos can be understood and repurposed for our own benefit. It is entirely possible to take your laziness, aversion to change, and excessive emotionality and make them work for your own benefit. Meditate, yes, seriously. Meditation and mindfulness have been discussed with a sort of breathless reverence for the past few years that has led cynical skeptics like myself to want to run fast in the other direction. After all, things positioned as too good to be true often are, in both capital markets and life more generally. But in the case of meditation, a deeper dive into the research gave me a greater sense of what the fuss was all about and convinced me that perhaps thousands of years of spiritual practice was better informed than my naive skepticism. If it's good enough for Ray Dalio, Paul Tudor Jones, BlackRock, Goldman Sachs, all of whom have meditation programs in place for employees, and literally billions of practitioners worldwide, maybe it's worth considering. 1011 of the central themes of this book is that working to slow down our reflexive thinking when making important financial decisions can lead to improved outcomes. To use Daniel Kahneman's parlance, thinking fast leads us to rely on heuristics, biases, and shortcuts, whereas the more effortful, thinking slow, leads us to consider decisions in their full contextual splendor. In one study, participants who took part in a mindfulness exercise and then were asked about their implicit associations with respect to age and race showed less reliance on bias than a control group who had not completed the mindfulness exercise. 102 The simple act of slowing down and heightening awareness reduced reliance on well-worn biases and allowed participants to judge people of different ages and races on their individual merits and not as an overgeneralized whole. The positive potential for applying such nuanced thinking to investment decision-making can hardly be overstated. Although it is a gross simplification, emotion in and around financial markets is often lumped into one of two categories: fear or greed. Meditation, it would seem, is well positioned to tame both. A meta-analysis of 47 trials and 3,515 participants found that meditation decreased anxiety, lessened depression, and decreased pain. Weaker, but still positive, evidence was found for reducing stress levels and improving overall quality of life. 103 For those on the fear end of the fear and greed continuum, meditation is powerful medicine. It is perhaps no surprise to learn that meditation can reduce anxiety, but the literature suggests that it can also rewire the way that we think about and anticipate rewards. Seeking out rewards is a universal human behavior, but taken to the extreme, greed can be becoming all-consuming, leading to everything from lower ratings of subjective well-being to Ponzi schemes of the Madoff variety. A study by Kirk, Brown and Downer that matched 34 meditators with 44 matched controls found that those who meditated showed lower neural activations in the caudate nucleus and ventromedial prefrontal cortex during reward anticipation when compared to their less enlightened peers. What does this all mean in plain English? The parts of the brain associated with greed, expecting and anticipating reward, are actually less active in the minds of those who meditate. Fear and greed, responsible for calamitous financial decisions as diverse as bank runs, investment bubbles, and affinity fraud, both show evidence of being tamed by the simple act of mindfulness meditation. Most impressive of all is the growing body of evidence that meditation seems to be able to physically restructure our bodies in certain ways, a reality that almost sounds like science fiction. Telomeres are pieces of DNA that cap our chromosomes and work to fight chromosomal deterioration. Although they are not thought to cause a particular disease per se, they do tend to shorten with age and are present in those with a variety of conditions including diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and mental illness. Dr. Linda E. Carlson compares them to the plastic cap on a shoelace which, if intact, keeps the larger lace from fraying and becoming worn. To study the impact of meditation on our physical health, Dr. Carlson assigned breast cancer survivors into 3 groups. The first group was randomly assigned to a 2-month meditation and yoga course, the second to a longer group therapy treatment protocol, and the control group received 6 hours of stress management training. When the blood of the 88 participants was analyzed, the telomere length of those in the meditation and therapy treatments were significantly longer than those in the stress management training. Amazingly, meditation and therapy seem just as adept at preserving our physical health as they are at preserving our sanity. 104 Don't be fooled by the monastic trappings of meditation. One needn't shave their head or wear orange robes to benefit from this time-tested strategy for managing emotion. At their core, mindfulness and meditation are all about focusing on present thoughts and actions in a non-judgmental way, a simple pursuit that is within reach of all of us. The CFA Society, led by Jason Voss, has developed a set of practical tools for novice meditators. Myriad apps exist for mobile meditators. The internet is full of practical advice for getting started, and books like Meditation for Fidgety Skeptics are emerging to help people like me to see the light. An investor in touch with the present moment is one that is able to own, label, and appreciate emotion without allowing it to unduly influence an important decision. Managing strong emotion. Throughout this book, I have professed a number of my more controversial beliefs about how asset managers should go about their business. I believe that a systematic approach to investing is optimal and